So this is the system I use to remember all the arthrokinematics of the upper extremity. I'm keeping the ones for the scapulothoracic joint out of this just because that's a whole other problem in general that I may get to another time. So the way we were kind of taught this was to remember the shapes at each joint, and from there kind of use that to figure out how motion occurs. If that works for you, awesome. That doesn't really work for me, so I try to go backwards with this. So I kind of ask myself what motion is being performed, and so if it's flexion in the upper extremity, that will always end up in an anterior roll or spin, whatever you want to call it. And so from there, you kind of use your knowledge of joints to remember these three right here, which is really 2.5. So if it's anterior roll at the glenohumeral joint, radiocarpal joint, and the ulnar half of the midcarpal joint, and anterior roll will end up in a posterior glide. And that's only at these joints. If an anterior roll ends up in an anterior glide, that will be pretty much every other joint in the upper extremity where flexion occurs. So let's kind of use this to answer a question. So let's say you're trying to determine the arthrokinematics for flexion at the humeral-ulnar joint. So, okay, the motion head occurring is flexion, and we know that always results in an anterior roll. So ask yourself, is it the GH joint, radiocarpal joint, or the ulnar half of the midcarpals? It is not, so that results in an anterior glide. And then from that, you see, okay, the ul and the glide are in the same direction. That means that the shape of that joint is concave on convex. And then for extension, it's the same way. Extension will always result in a posterior roll at every joint in the upper extremity that can perform extension. And then if it goes in the opposite direction of the glide, it's the same kind of 2.5 joints where that occurs. And then the same thing, everything else results in a posterior glide. Right. So obviously there are more movements in the upper extremity than just flexion and extension. And the rule I use for that is that the joint will spin or roll the same direction and glide the opposite direction that the hand moves. So let's look at abduction for the glenohumeral joint. So when you abduct the shoulder, and your hand will move up. And so, just what's another word for up? Superior. So, using this rule, we can determine that the head of the humerus will roll superior and glide inferior in the GH joint. And then for adduction, hand moves down. Another word for down is inferior. So just use the roll again. It will roll inferior and glide superior. I hope that kind of makes sense to y'all as much as it did to me. The same thing applies for almost all the non-flexion and extension movements in the upper extremity. There is one kind of outlier that you do have to memorize individually, but I tried to make that a little more simple. I'm talking about the proximal and the distal radio-ulnar joint where pronation and supination occurs. So for proximal, what I remember is both proximal and opposite have the letter O in them, and distal and same both have the letter A in it. So with that, I can remember proximal is concave on convex, and the distal is convex on concave. So from there I can think, so at the proximal radial ulnar joint, for pronation, I know it rolls anteriorly, and so I can kind of use like the rule up here to determine that the glide will be posterior in the opposite direction. And then down here, the distal radial ulnar joint for pronation, it's an anterior roll, and then I know they both have an A in it for same and distal, so I can go, okay, it'll both spin and glide anterior.